It's 1692 in Massachusetts, in a small Puritan settlement called Salem Village, and I need you to understand the vibe of this place, because the vibe is the whole story. The Puritans were not, as a culture, known for their relaxing weekends. This was a community built on the foundational belief that the devil was real, that he was extremely active, that he was probably in the room with you right now, and that your neighbour might be working for him. Add to that a long, brutal winter, ongoing anxiety about attacks on the frontier, a couple of nasty local property disputes, and the general Puritan hobby of assuming everyone was one bad thought away from damnation. And you have a community that is, let's say, primed. It's a room absolutely soaked in gasoline, and everyone is wondering why it's so cold. Then 2 young girls in the household of the local minister started behaving strangely. Fits, contortions, screaming, complaints of being pinched and pricked by unseen forces. Now, a modern person has a lot of possible explanations for this. The people of Salem Village had exactly one, and they went straight to it. Witchcraft, obviously. What else could it possibly be? It certainly couldn't be 2 bored, stressed children in a joyless town discovering that this particular behaviour got them an unprecedented amount of attention. The local doctor was consulted, examined the girls, found nothing physically wrong, and delivered the professional medical opinion that the cause was, and I want to stress this was the official diagnosis, the evil hand. That's it. That's the paperwork. And once a doctor signs off on demonic possession, things tend to escalate. So the adults did the sensible thing, which was to pressure the frightened children to name names. Who was doing this to you? Who are the witches? And here is where the whole grim machine really starts turning, because the girls, under enormous pressure to produce culprits, produced culprits. The first accused were, predictably, the easy targets. A homeless beggar, an enslaved woman in the minister's own household, an older woman who had stopped attending church and had a reputation for being difficult. In other words, the community looked around for the devil's agents and, astonishingly, landed on the poorest and least popular people available. The devil, apparently, only recruits from the bottom of the social ladder and never ever from among the respectable. Funny how that works. And then the accusations spread. Because once the first few people were arrested, a truly catastrophic piece of logic took hold. The way to prove you weren't a witch was to confess to being a witch and then name other witches. Think about the machinery of that for a second. If you denied it, you were a lying witch, and you'd hang. If you confessed and accused others, you were a cooperative, repentant witch, and you'd generally live. So the system did not reward innocence. The system rewarded accusation. It was a pyramid scheme where the product was your neighbours, and the only way to save yourself was to recruit. Predictably, the accusations exploded. Neighbour turned on neighbour, often with a suspicious overlap between accused witch and person I've been feuding with over a fence. Old grudges, land disputes, and petty resentments suddenly had a supernatural delivery system. You didn't like someone. The devil did too, apparently. Now let's talk about the trials themselves, because the legal standard here is genuinely something to behold. The court accepted what was called spectral evidence. This meant that if an accuser claimed to see the accused person's spirit, their spectre, tormenting them, that counted as evidence in court. So a teenage girl could stand up, point at a respected woman, claim that the woman's invisible ghost was, at that very moment, biting her, and the court would treat this as a serious data point. There was no defense against this. You cannot produce an alibi for your own invisible spirit. You cannot cross-examine a hallucination. If someone said your spectre did it, your spectre did it, and the fact that you were demonstrably somewhere else, being a person, was legally irrelevant. The courtroom scenes became performances. The afflicted girls would writhe and scream in the presence of the accused, and this display, this piece of live theatre, was taken as proof of guilt. If you were on trial and your accusers started convulsing, that was bad for you. If they didn't, well, they usually did. And so people started to die. They were tried, condemned, and executed, 19 of them by hanging, over the course of that year. And I want to be specific about one of them, because it captures the whole insane spirit of the thing. An elderly man refused to enter a plea at all. He would not say guilty, he would not say not guilty, because he understood the game was rigged either way. And the legal method used to try to force a plea out of him was to lay him under heavy stones and add more weight gradually to make him talk. He was pressed to death over 2 days. According to the enduring account, his final words were a request for more weight, which is either the bleakest possible act of defiance or the most exhausted, and honestly, in his position, I take the point. Others died in prison, waiting, in conditions that were their own quiet death sentence. Children were jailed. People confessed to absurd, impossible things, flying, signing the devil's book, attending secret gatherings, because confessing kept you alive and dignity does not keep you alive. So how does something like this stop? Not through a sudden outbreak of reason, sadly. It stopped, more or less, when the accusations started climbing the social ladder, when the accusers got ambitious and began naming prominent, well-connected people, including, reportedly, the governor's own wife. And it turns out that a legal theory everyone found perfectly sound when it was killing beggars became suddenly, urgently questionable the moment it threatened the respectable. Spectral evidence was quietly thrown out. Without it, the cases collapsed. The trials wound down. The remaining accused were eventually released or pardoned. And then came the part that I find almost more revealing than the panic itself, the cleanup. In the years after, people involved began to apologize. One of the judges stood in church and had a public statement of guilt read out. Some of the jurors signed a collective apology. The colony eventually held a day of fasting to atone, and much later formally cleared names and offered restitution to families, which is a decent thing to do, and also arrives with the specific energy of someone apologizing for a fire after the house has already burned down. Sorry about your grandmother. We've reviewed our procedures. So, let's get to the number, because that's why we're here. And this one, I can actually give you fairly precisely, which makes a nice change. 25. Roughly 25 people died as a direct result of the Salem Witch Trials. 19 were hanged. 1 was pressed to death under stones, and around 5 more died in jail awaiting a justice that was never going to come. 25. And I know, after Rome and the Mongols, 25 sounds almost small. But here's the revelation, and it's the reason this tiny number matters more than some of the enormous ones. Salem wasn't a war. There was no invading army, no plague, no famine, no natural disaster. 25 people were killed by nothing at all, by a rumor, by fear given a courtroom and a signature, by a community that talked itself, step by logical step, into executing its own members over evidence that did not physically exist. No enemy did this to them. They did it to themselves, methodically, with paperwork, and with the full sincere belief that they were the good ones. That's the part worth keeping. The deadliest ingredient at Salem wasn't the devil. It was a group of frightened people, absolutely certain they were right, granted just enough authority to act on it. And that particular ingredient has never once gone out of stock. Anyway, that was Salem.